Welcome back, everyone, to this section of the course on hypothesis testing. One of the most crucial capabilities an organization needs is the ability to test a theory or hypothesis. Companies often want to test potential effects before rolling out new features or services to all their users. In this section, we're going to be talking about topics related to hypothesis testing, like significance level and type 1 versus type 2 errors, one-tailed tests and two-tailed tests, the p-value, and A/B testing. Understanding hypothesis testing provides a well-studied statistical process and foundation for testing new features or analyzing results as a company or organization. Let me give you a few examples of the types of things companies can test with hypothesis testing. So you can test things like the effectiveness of vaccines or medications. You can also do A/B testing for changes on a website, such as testing whether or not a new color button actually improves conversions. You can also do things like testing changes to schedules for efficiency, such as are workers just working 4 days a week more productive than workers working 5 days a week. You can also do things like test the effects of different agricultural procedures on crops, like whether or not to use fertilizer. In general, a hypothesis can be stated as something in this term. If we do blank, then blank will happen. And let's get actually a little more specific and frame this in statistical terms. When we're thinking of hypothesis testing and what a hypothesis is, we're typically thinking of something in the terms of if we do blank to an independent variable, then blank will happen to a dependent variable. So let's actually match up this sort of general statistical definition to some of the example cases we've mentioned. So for example, I could say if we give patients a medication, then their white blood cell count will increase. And that could be an example of a hypothesis that I can test. Also note that I could technically model this as a before versus after medication test. So I could take the same group of people, count their white blood cells, then give them the medication and count the white blood cells post-medication. Or I could split people into two groups, a control group that doesn't take the medication versus a group that does take the medication. So let's do another example of, again, blank to an independent variable, then blank will happen to a dependent variable. So we can say something like, if I add a fertilizer to the soil, then crop yields will increase. So again, this test would require a fair comparison between a non-fertilized crop against the same fertilized crop. So I should try to make sure that all the other independent variables are as similar as possible between the groups. So an obvious one would be the crop itself. I probably want to compare non-fertilized corn versus the same corn, just fertilized. It's not really helpful to do something like non-fertilized oranges versus fertilized cucumbers. We want to try to keep all the other independent variables the same. And we'll discuss in a second about testing multiple independent variables. So for example, if we think of another hypothesis, I could say something like, if we change the purchase button to a larger font and brighter color, then more customers will complete a purchase. Now you should notice this hypothesis is a little different than the ones we previously saw. This is basically an A/B test of a website, with A being the original button and B being the new button with a larger font and brighter color. However, this particular example has an important factor. You may have noticed that we're actually changing two independent variables at the same time. I'm changing both larger font and brighter color. So while it's certainly possible to conduct a hypothesis test with multiple independent variable changes against a dependent variable, we can see that this could make it unclear what independent variable is actually causing the effect or change in behavior. And statistically speaking, while there are techniques to actually conduct changes across multiple independent variables, the cost, so to speak, is you usually have to gather a lot more data. And we've previously mentioned that companies with a lot of users, like Facebook or Google, typically have enough users that testing multiple independent variable changes is actually not a big deal for them, because they can easily test small percentages of their users, but still have really large data sets, like 1 million users out of 2 billion customers. So again, to frame that last hypothesis, you're going to be asking yourself questions like, was it the color of the button that caused the effect, or the font size, or both changes put together? And as I mentioned, there's many established statistical methods to test changes across multiple independent variables. But for right now, I want to focus this section on just testing singular changes to a single independent variable. Like many of the other topics we've covered, hypothesis testing can seem intimidating due to terminology. And throughout this entire course, we've been trying to simplify a lot of the terminology to give you an intuition of what's actually going on behind the scenes. So you may hear terminology like null hypothesis and some esoteric phrasing like failed to reject the null hypothesis. Let's guide you through a simple example so you get more comfortable with terms like failed to reject and null hypothesis. So we're going to start off with a test situation or scenario. Imagine that we're in charge of a large e-commerce company and we run a website. And what we're going to do is we're going to change the size of the font to a larger size across the entire website. So all the font you see on the website is going to be slightly larger. And we have a hypothesis that if we're going to change the font size, then the customers are going to spend more money. Since our website is online, we can show some customers the original font size and measure their spend, and simultaneously show another segment of customers the larger font size and measure their spend. When conducting tests like this one, we always want to try to make sure that the test audiences are similar to each other. So I want to make sure my control audience that's going to see the original font size is roughly similar to the test audience that is seeing the larger font size, in order to prevent possible outside factors from contributing to any change in the dependent variable, which in this case is spend. So now that we understand the scenario, let's frame this so that we slowly build up to the definition of a null hypothesis. So I'm going to describe a situation where kind of a silly but very specific hypothesis is posited, and then we're going to use that to build our understanding of rejecting and failing to reject a null hypothesis. So let's imagine that I'm going to build up to a kind of hyper-specific hypothesis. I'm going to say customers viewing larger font size will spend $100 more on the website. And how did I come up with this hypothesis? Maybe I ran a really small preliminary test, comparing a test group to a control group. And remember, the test group is going to see that larger font size. So I run this small preliminary test, and I have a test group, there's 3 customers in it, and then a control group, another 3 customers, and you probably need more than these customers, but we're keeping things simple for now. I take the average values of their spend, and I see that on average, the test group viewing the larger font size is going to spend $100 more versus the control group. So I come up from this preliminary testing with this very specific hypothesis that customers viewing the larger font size will spend $100 more on the website. And we'll see that this causes issues further down the line. But let's just get this idea of reject versus fail to reject, and then we'll build up to a null hypothesis, which is a lot broader and a lot easier to use. So again, there's $100 more on average spent versus the test versus control. So now that I've done the preliminary test, I start rolling out this experimentation to the real world. So I test this on new customers on the website after my little preliminary test that helped me define my hypothesis. But then I have issues. I noticed that when I actually roll this out to the real world, my test group is spending less than the control group. And now I see in pretty much every situation that the test group that is viewing the larger font size ends up spending less than the control group. So what happens if the rest of the experimental tests end up showing the opposite effect? Well, in that case, I'm going to decide to reject that hypothesis, since none of my other experiments actually ended up supporting this. So I'm going to reject the hypothesis that customers viewing larger font size will spend $100 more on the website. Now, let's imagine that we rewind time. So now, again, I'm going to test the new font size on the web page for a variety of groups. And this time, if we rewind time and pretend that we were to redo this experiment, what happens if I get the same trend, but it's not exactly a $100 difference? So I test this out in a variety of experiments, and the test group does, in fact, spend more than the control group. But you'll notice, if you pay close attention to these actual experimental examples, it's not exactly a $100 difference. So in one experiment, it was 103, another experiment was 160, 75, and 72 difference, and so on. So here we have a bit of a conundrum. none of the experiments are exactly reflecting my hypothesis. So I cannot say that my hypothesis is exactly 100% correct. Because remember, my hypothesis is actually really specific. It says that the customers are going to spend $100 more on the website. And technically speaking, while the general trend was the same through the rest of my experimentation, none of the actual experiments showed the test group spending exactly $100 more. So the best that I conclude here is I'm going to fail to reject the hypothesis. Notice how that wording is different than saying that the hypothesis is 100% true or that I accept the hypothesis as a truth. Instead, I'm just failing to reject the hypothesis. Since the amounts weren't exactly $100, I can't say the hypothesis is accepted. So instead, I use that very specific terminology of failing to reject the hypothesis. So again, the difference is you reject the hypothesis or you fail to reject the hypothesis. Now, I've already mentioned a couple times that this idea of exactly $100 more is kind of troublesome. So is there a better way to actually define the hypothesis, perhaps? Well, so far we've realized I can create the hypothesis and I can reject it if the testing data in the experiments don't support the hypothesis. This was the case when testing showed that the font size change didn't cause more spend than the control groups. We've also seen the cases that the experiments have the same trend, but not the same exact amount of $100 more in spend. I technically can't say that the hypothesis is absolutely correct. So instead, I frame my phrasing as I fail to reject the hypothesis. So recall the hypothesis itself. Customers viewing the larger font size will spend $100 more on the website. Technically speaking, our goal is not really to show that the change is exactly $100. But if I think about this from a broader viewpoint of the company or organization, what I'm really trying to prove is that changing the font size has some effect on spend. Now, since we've established that we operate in a framework where we either reject or fail to reject a hypothesis, in this framework, it probably makes more sense to use what's known as a null hypothesis, where we posit simply that there is no difference between the two groups, that is the test and the control. So that is, there is null effect or no effect. That's why it's called the null hypothesis. And you'll realize it becomes a lot easier, statistically speaking, to just frame this null hypothesis regardless of what you're actually testing. A null hypothesis allows us to not need to worry about an exact quantitative value of change or effect. So I don't really need to worry about saying it's going to be exactly $100 or exactly $101. Instead, I reframe the entire question. And now I'm really just asking, did this particular change have an effect? And notice how that matches a lot more to our generalized statement of hypothesis. So for example, I could say larger font size has no effect on customer spend. That's the null hypothesis version of the hypothesis that we saw previously. Notice again how a null hypothesis no longer even requires us to do any preliminary tests, because I don't need to acquire some range like $100. So this whole idea of trying to do a little preliminary test to figure out the expected range, I throw that out the window with the null hypothesis, because all I'm doing is I'm just framing it as if this change is going to have no effect. That is my hypothesis. And that null hypothesis works a lot better in the framework of reject or fail to reject. So now let's go through a simple example of using the null hypothesis framework. Remember, now my null hypothesis is just saying whatever this change is doesn't have an effect. It has null effect, which means I no longer need to worry about running a preliminary experiment to figure out something like a $100 value. Instead, now that I've established a null hypothesis, I just go and run the experiment. So let's imagine that we do see a difference between test and control. Then what I can do here is I can reject the null hypothesis. Now, in the case where test and control were actually really quite similar and it looked like there wasn't any effect, then I could say that I failed to reject the null hypothesis. Now, we haven't really discussed how much of an effect is needed to determine whether we reject or fail to reject. That's actually going to come later on in this section with a discussion of p-values and statistical significance. So there is going to be some metric to understand whether you decide to reject or fail to reject, but we'll talk about that later on. Really, the purpose of this lecture was to get you familiar with the idea of a null hypothesis and the framework of rejecting or failing to reject. So along with a null hypothesis, like larger font size has no effect on customer spend, we also have an alternative hypothesis, which is essentially the opposite. It basically says that a larger font size does have an effect on customer spend. So you have the null hypothesis where there is no effect. The alternative is that there is an effect. Notice how neither the null hypothesis or the alternative hypothesis is actually specific to the strength of the effect. It's really just there is no effect or there is an effect. Now, to fully understand hypothesis testing beyond this simple example, we first need to understand to learn how to evaluate the differences between results of groups to determine whether or not the effect is what's known as statistically significant. So let's move on to learn about how to use things like one-tailed and two-tailed tests to set up hypothesis testing for different situations, and discover how to use p-values to quantitatively state the likelihoods of an effect being statistically significant. We'll see you at the next lecture.